Nurses passed with clipboards and carts. Machines beeped softly behind closed doors. For someone who had been surrounded by silence for weeks, the noise was overwhelming. Henry stayed close to her side as they moved through the corridors. The doctor was already waiting in his office, a man in his 60s with glasses that slid down his nose and eyes that had seen too much pain to ever judge it. "Miss Zhang," he said kindly, "let's take a look." The eye exam took an hour. Quiet commands, blinking lights, drops that stung, flashes of light that made her wince. Afterward, the doctor turned to Henry. "Her optic nerves are intact," he said, "which is good. The damage appears to be trauma-induced, possibly psychological as well as physical. Can she recover? With surgery, yes. But more importantly, she needs emotional stability. The mind protects itself when it's been hurt too deeply. Memory loss in this case isn't just physical. It's protective." Henry glanced at Zhang, who sat still, her lips pressed tightly together. "And the memory?" he asked. "There's no guarantee. But the more safe she feels, the more likely it is to return. Whether she's ready to face what she remembers, that's another matter entirely." That night, Henry booked them into a quiet hotel near the hospital. He took the room next to hers, making sure she had everything she needed. Zhang didn't say much after they returned. She ate only a little, then sat near the window, watching the neon signs flicker across nearby buildings. Her reflection stared back at her, a stranger with eyes she didn't recognize. Inside her chest, a storm was building. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run. She wanted to remember. And yet she was terrified of what she might find. The knock on the door came just past midnight. She opened it cautiously. Henry stood there holding a small envelope. "What is it?" He handed it to her. "We found something." She opened it slowly, her fingers trembling. Inside was a photograph. Two people, herself smiling, whole, radiant, and a man standing beside her, arm around her shoulder. She didn't recognize him, but something deep inside her twisted like a blade being pulled from a wound. "Who is he?" she asked. "We're not sure yet," Henry said. "But this photo was taken 3 days before your accident." She sat down, the photo trembling in her hands. "I know that place," she whispered. I think I've been there before." Henry leaned forward. "Do you want to go back?" She didn't answer right away. Then quietly she nodded. The next morning was gray and heavy. Rain clung to the windows as if trying to hold back the world outside. Zhang stood at the window, still holding the photograph. Her hands had stopped trembling, but inside her chest was tight, as though each breath carried weight she couldn't see. Henry entered with 2 cups of tea. "We'll leave in 15 minutes, he said. "If you're ready." She nodded, not looking away from the rain. They drove for hours. The road twisted through narrow towns and past rivers swollen with weeks of rain. Eventually, the car turned off onto a gravel path surrounded by reeds, and ahead, partially collapsed by erosion, was the old pier. The place where she had been found. Zhang stepped out slowly. Her shoes sank into the soft earth. Wind rustled through the trees, and the smell of wet soil and moss filled the air. She closed her eyes. Something flickered in the darkness of her mind. Images without sound, feelings without shape. She walked forward slowly, each step echoing across a fragile space inside her. Then suddenly a scream. Not real. Not now. A memory. She stumbled, falling to her knees. Henry rushed to her side. "Zhang!" She gripped the soil. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps. I saw someone standing here, yelling." "Who?" She clutched her head. "I don't know, but he was angry. He said something about betrayal." "Take your time," Henry said, holding her shoulders. "You're safe now." "No," she whispered. "No one's safe." Later that day, Henry reviewed security footage from a gas station nearby. A camera from the day of the incident showed a black van parked for 15 minutes, facing the river. The license plate had been removed, but there was a sticker in the corner of the windshield, faint peeling, a membership to a shipping guild located 3 towns away. He made a call. "Get me records of every shipment processed by the East Harbor Logistics Company in the past 6 months. I want full manifests, names, times, and destination codes." "Yes, sir," Nam replied on the line. Also, the man in the photo with Zhang has been identified. Name's Fan Kwok, former associate of her father. Henry's stomach twisted. What happened to him? Dead. Car accident. 2 days before Zhang was found. Henry sat down, the pieces falling into a sickening pattern. Someone's tying up loose ends. Back at the hotel, Zhang was lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling. When Henry returned, she didn't speak. He sat beside her, silent for a while. Do you believe people can erase parts of themselves? She asked suddenly. He looked at her. I don't mean forgetting, she said. I mean choosing to not be who they were. Yes, he replied. But the truth always waits. Sooner or later it knocks. She turned her head toward him. Then I think I've been hiding from myself. But I don't know what I'm afraid of. He reached into his coat pocket and handed her a folded paper. This came from one of your old apartment leases. You lived here in the city under the name Zhang until a year ago. And you worked for your father's old company. She stared at it. I don't remember that place. But someone did, he said. And they burned it to the ground 2 weeks after your disappearance. They visited the ruins together. The building was nothing more than twisted beams and blackened walls now. But the moment Zhang stepped into the remains, her knees buckled again. I remember this smell, she whispered. Henry helped her sit. Don't force it. I came here. Looking for something. What? I don't know. She reached into her coat pocket, pulling out the broken necklace Henry had returned to her days earlier. It shook in her hands. Someone gave this to me. Said it would protect me. But I think it's what made me a target. Henry leaned closer. You think you were attacked because of what you knew? I think I saw something I wasn't supposed to, and someone made sure I forgot. That night, Henry received an urgent call from Nam. We found someone, Nam said, voice tense. A warehouse guard. He worked night shifts at one of the shell companies connected to Fan Kwok. Said he saw a woman arguing with Fan 2 nights before his death. Henry stood. Where is he? Hiding. He's terrified. Says people are watching him. He agreed to talk, but only face to face. And he wants protection. Arrange a meeting. Tomorrow. Somewhere public. There's more, Nam added. He said the woman looked just like Zhang. They met in a crowded bus terminal cafe the next day. The man, scruffy, jittery, eyes darting constantly, kept his hoodie pulled tight over his face. You're Henry? He asked. Henry nodded. You saw her. The man leaned in, voice a whisper. I didn't know her name. But yeah, she came to the warehouse. She was angry. Told Fan Kwok he was lying to her. Something about a hidden account, forged documents. She said someone was stealing from her father's legacy. Henry froze. She was working with him? He asked. I don't know. But she seemed betrayed. Zhang, sitting beside Henry, paled. Did I threaten him? The man looked at her for a long time. No. You warned him. You told him if he didn't come clean, you'd go public. Zhang swallowed hard. Her voice was barely audible. And then he died. Henry turned to her, his voice steady. This proves something important. You weren't just a victim. You were a whistleblower. But just as they left the cafe, Henry noticed a black motorcycle across the street. It had no license plate, and the rider wore a dark helmet with a mirrored visor. He didn't move, just watched. Henry's instinct screamed. He pushed Zhang behind him. Get in the car. Now. They didn't speak on the drive back, but he made 3 extra turns and switched routes twice before heading back to the hotel. The motorcycle was never far behind. Whoever had tried to bury her past wasn't finished. That night, Zhang couldn't sleep. She stood at the window, staring at the darkened city. I wasn't just running from the truth, she said as Henry entered the room. I was trying to fight it. He sat down. You remembered more? I think. I was trying to recover something. A document. Something connected to my father's company. I knew it would prove who stole everything after his death. Henry nodded. And someone tried to stop you. I don't think they just wanted to stop me. I think they wanted to destroy me. She turned to him, her voice suddenly sharp with fear. Henry, what if they're watching us right now? He didn't answer at first. Then, they are. Henry hadn't slept. The digital clock on the hotel room wall blinked past 3 a.m., but his eyes remained fixed on the ceiling, as if somewhere up there, beyond the paint, beyond the floors above, the answer was waiting. Zhang's revelations from the previous night looped through his mind. Forged documents, a betrayed legacy, a warehouse that had burned before anyone could investigate. She had remembered things. Not everything, but enough to make her a target. He got up, pulled on his coat, and stepped into the hallway. Across the corridor, her door remained closed. He didn't knock. Not yet. She needed rest. Something she hadn't truly had since the night her life had been shattered. But as he turned back toward his room, he felt it. A noise, subtle but out of place. Not from the hallway. From the fire exit. His instincts snapped into place. He moved swiftly down the corridor, hand near the small weapon tucked under his coat. The emergency stairwell door was ajar, just slightly. Not enough to trip an alarm. Just enough to let someone slip through. He stepped inside. Silence. Then a footstep above. Someone was moving down. Slowly. Quietly. He didn't wait. He ran up the stairs 2 steps at a time, reaching the landing just in time to see a shadow turn and retreat toward the roof access. Henry pursued, bursting through the heavy door into the cold night air. The roof was empty almost. A figure in black sprinted across the gravel, leapt over the side railing and disappeared. Henry rushed forward, looking over the edge. Rope. They had scaled down the building fast, professional. This wasn't a warning. This was surveillance. And the message was clear. We know where you are. By morning, Zhang sat on the edge of her bed, her eyes half open, lost between memory and fear. She held the necklace again, her thumb tracing the etched letters on the locket. Henry entered quietly. Did you sleep? She shook her head. I remembered something else. He sat beside her. I used to visit a certain lawyer. A woman. She helped me after my father died. But I stopped seeing her suddenly. I think someone warned me to cut all contact. Do you remember her name? No. But I remember her office had a cracked window. And the sound of birds. A lot of birds. She liked to feed them. Henry pulled out his tablet. Give me 5 minutes. They found her on the outskirts of the city. A small office with peeling white paint and ivy climbing the stone walls. The nameplate read, Tran Minh Huynh Legal Affairs, Civil and Corporate. Henry knocked. A moment passed. Then a woman in her late 40s opened the door. She wore glasses and a pale blue blouse, and her eyes, sharp and tired, widened the moment she saw Zhang. Tra Zhang? Zhang's breath caught in her throat. You remember me? She asked. Of course I do. Everyone thought you were dead. Inside, the office was modest but neat. Folders were stacked in old wooden cabinets. A kettle steamed quietly in the corner. You came to me about your father's will, Huynh said. You suspected foul play. You said you found inconsistencies in the company's transfer of ownership. But then you stopped coming. I tried to call you, but your number was disconnected. Did I leave anything here? Huynh opened a locked drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope. You told me not to open this unless you came back. You said if anything happened to you, it should be delivered directly to the press. Henry reached for it. May I? Huynh handed it over. Inside were photocopies of company contracts, with signatures that didn't match, forged dates, and one document in particular that sent chills down Henry's spine. An offshore transfer, hundreds of millions, under Zhang's name. Only she had never authorized it. They left the office in silence, both of them shaken. It wasn't just about hiding a crime, Zhang said softly. They used me. They used my name. My father's company. They stole everything. Henry stopped walking. And they tried to kill you when you got too close to the truth. Zhang nodded, tears in her eyes. Fan Kwok, he must have helped them. And when I found out, they killed him too. Henry's phone buzzed. Nam again. We've got a problem, Nam said. One of our undercover units just intercepted a call. Someone's putting a bounty on Zhang's head. They know she's alive. And they want her silenced before she goes public. Henry's voice dropped. How much? Enough that they'll come in broad daylight. Back at the hotel, Zhang began packing her things in silence. She didn't speak. Didn't cry. She moved like someone preparing for war. Henry stood by the window watching the streets below. "We're leaving tonight," he said. "I'll call and secure transport." Zhang turned to him. "No," she said. "We go now." He met her eyes and saw it. The fear was still there, buried deep, but now it sat beside something stronger. Resolve. They left through the underground garage. Henry had arranged for a low-profile car with tinted windows and no GPS tracking. He drove, fast and silent, weaving through the side streets of the city as dusk fell. Zhang sat beside him, clutching the envelope like it was the only thing tying her to reality. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere they won't find us. A friend of mine runs a safe house in District 9. A place they'd never look." Zhang nodded, but her voice remained low. "We can't run forever." "We're not running. We're buying time. Enough to decide what to do next, and how to strike back." The streets blurred past, but in her mind fragments sharpened. The heat of confrontation, her father's voice before his death, the sound of glass shattering, and now the price on her life. They reached a gate behind a warehouse compound, where an older man with a long scar under his eye let them in without a word. The room they were led to was bare. Mattress on the floor, blackout curtains, one single dim light. Zhang sat down slowly. "This is the first time I've felt safe in weeks." "You're not alone anymore," Henry said. But safety didn't last long. The next morning, a transmission came through Nam's encrypted channel. "Henry, one of our sources just got word. The gang knows about the envelope. They're not just after Zhang, they're after you now too. You need to move again." Henry looked across the room at Zhang, who was sitting at the window, watching the alley in silence. "We need to get that envelope into the right hands before they take it from us," he said. Nam's voice crackled. "Agreed. There's a journalist, trusted, underground, not bought out like the rest. Her name's Lin Dao. She's based in Da Nang. Get to her. I'll need transport. I'll handle it. But Henry," a pause. "They've put someone special on the job. A cleaner. Silent. Precise. Name. None. Just a black mark and a bullet." They left the safe house before sunrise, switching cars twice. Zhang had changed into a plain hoodie and jeans. She no longer looked like the daughter of a corporate tycoon. She looked like a ghost of her former self, stripped down, focused, alert. As the highway stretched out before them, she spoke without turning her head. "Do you think we'll make it?" "Yes. But if we don't?" Henry didn't hesitate. "Then someone else will carry the truth forward. But we're going to finish this." She reached into her bag and pulled out the envelope. "Promise me," she said, holding it out. "If anything happens to me, you deliver this." He took it slowly. "I promise." Just 2 hours outside Da Nang, the trap was sprung. A truck jackknifed it across the road, blocking all lanes. Henry slammed the brakes. Behind them, a black SUV emerged from the tree line. "Out!" he barked, pulling Zhang toward the side of the road. Gunfire cracked behind them as they sprinted down the hill into the forest. Branches whipped their faces, mud clung to their shoes, but they kept running. Eventually, they reached a dried-up creek bed and dropped behind a thick tree. Henry peered up the slope. The SUV was gone. For now. They walked for miles, avoiding roads, until they found an old shed behind a ruined farmhouse. Inside, the floor was damp and smelled of earth, but it was shelter. Henry lit a small lamp. Zhang sat on a wooden crate, clutching her knees. "I remember something else," she said softly. "The last thing my father said to me." Henry leaned in. He said, "Don't trust the board. They're not who they say they are." Henry nodded. He was right. Tears welled in her eyes. "I think I ignored him. I wanted to believe the company could survive. That the people we worked with, people I knew, would never betray us. You tried to fix it. But I failed. And now people are dead." "No," he said. "You're still here. That means the truth is still alive." They reached Da Nang under heavy rain. The city lights reflected off the wet asphalt like broken memories. Henry drove them through alleyways and avoided the main roads. Zhang stared out the window in silence, the envelope now hidden under her jacket, wrapped in a layer of plastic and tape. They stopped in front of a small bookstore. Its sign was faded, and the windows were dark. "This is it?" Zhang asked. "She runs her operation from the back. No staff. Just her." They knocked twice, waited, then knocked once more. A moment later, a woman opened the door. She looked older than her age, her eyes sharp, her voice low. "You're late. You're Lindau?" Henry asked. "I was 10 minutes ago. Now I'm a ghost with an itchy trigger finger. Come inside." They stepped into the narrow space, shelves packed with books on politics, law, and resistance. In the back, a second room with soundproof panels and an old camera pointed at a desk. Zhang handed her the envelope. Dao scanned it in silence. Her eyes widened slowly. "Where did you get this?" "It's mine," Zhang said. "They used my name. My father's company. They killed to keep this buried." Dao looked at Henry. "You realize what this is? If I publish this, people will die. People in suits. In government. In the press. Then you need to be fast," he said. "I need time to verify." "You have 12 hours, Zhang said. "That's how long it'll take them to find us again." They spent the night in an abandoned apartment above the bookstore. Zhang sat on the floor, knees pulled to her chest, staring at the cracks in the ceiling. "I never thought I'd become this version of myself," she whispered. Henry looked over from where he was cleaning a small wound on his arm. "What version?" "The kind that has nothing left to lose." He walked over, sat beside her. "You still have something," he said. She looked at him, questioning. "You have truth, and truth terrifies them." She smiled faintly. "You make it sound heroic." "It is. Most people die before they get to face it." But before dawn, Lindau's voice crackled through the burner phone. "They're here." Henry's breath caught. "I stalled them for now. Told them I needed more time. But someone tipped them off. You need to leave. Now." "Did you upload it?" "Not yet. I want to go with you. I need to protect the source. We'll meet you at the bridge near the western exit. 1 hour." They left on foot through back streets, taking only what they could carry. Rain pelted them as they moved under the dim streetlights. The bridge came into view, and so did a man standing beside it. Black coat, black gloves, umbrella tilted low. Henry stopped. Zhang's grip on his arm tightened. The man looked up. No face, only a mask. He pulled out a pistol, silenced. Henry pushed Zhang behind a pillar. Shots cracked through the air. Henry returned fire, backing away, but the man moved like smoke, always a step ahead. Then, a car skidded into view. Lindau opened the door. "In." They jumped in as bullets shattered the rear window. The car peeled away down the hill. Henry looked back. The man wasn't chasing. He was watching. The farmhouse stood at the edge of a rice field, far from the city's reach. Mist rolled over the hills, and the sound of frogs filled the night. They had driven 6 hours without stopping, barely speaking. Their minds haunted by the masked man and the knowledge that this fight was no longer just about revenge. It was about survival. Inside, Lindau laid out the printed pages on the old wooden table. She had managed to upload part of the files to an offshore server just before they left. "It's not enough to leak this anonymously," she said. "They'll bury it, discredit it. We need to attach a face, a voice, a survivor." Zhang sat still, her expression unreadable. "You mean me," she said. "You're the only one who can." Henry turned to her. "You don't have to. We can disappear. Live quietly. Let someone else carry it." Zhang looked out the window. The sun was rising now, casting golden light across the water. "No," she said. "I've been silent too long." The interview was recorded in a single take. No edits. No filters. Zhang spoke clearly, her voice calm but fierce. She told the world everything. How her father had been betrayed, how his partners had sold the company from beneath him, how her name had been forged to move illegal money across borders. She named the shell companies, the officials, the enforcers, the deaths. She ended with one line. "I am not afraid anymore." The video was released through multiple encrypted channels. Lindau's network spread it to foreign outlets, whistleblower forums, and independent newsrooms. Within hours it went viral. And within hours the retaliation began. The first explosion hit a nearby fuel depot. Then a factory tied to one of the shell companies was burned to the ground by its own people. They weren't trying to stop the leak. They were erasing the evidence. Henry paced the farmhouse as reports rolled in. Arrests, Murders. Disappearances. They're collapsing the entire operation, he said. Scorched earth. Zhang sat beside the fireplace, holding a photo of her father. That means they're scared. But then silence. No more calls. No more sightings. Even the masked man vanished. It was as if the syndicate had folded in on itself. For weeks they stayed hidden, waiting for the storm to return. It never did. One morning, Henry walked out to find Zhang in the garden, her hands dirty from planting small rows of vegetables. She looked peaceful. "Oh, you're still here," she said without looking up. "I'm not going anywhere," he replied. They stood in silence for a while. Then Zhang looked at him. "What do we do now?" He smiled. "Whatever we want." She nodded slowly. "But first," she added, "I want to find my mother." Henry tilted his head. "You remember her?" Zhang didn't answer right away. Just a whisper. "Not yet." Far away, in a high-rise office overlooking the sea, a man watched the interview one last time before deleting the file. He lit a cigarette, leaned back, and muttered under his breath, "She's just getting started." Then he smiled and picked up the phone. Henry stood alone in the cold office, staring at a single file folder resting on the metal table. It was thin but dense with implications, the kind of case that didn't just echo through the corridors of power but carved scars into lives. The name at the top, Nguyen Tra Zhang. Her photograph was clipped to the front. Eyes closed, hospital band around her wrist, face bruised, fragile. But beneath that delicate surface there was something else, something that made Henry pause every time he looked at her. She wasn't just a victim. She was a key. "Sir." His lieutenant entered quietly. "These are the documents you requested." Henry didn't look up. "Did you verify them?" "Yes." Multiple shell corporations, each one registered under different aliases, fake directors, offshore transactions. They're not just laundering money. They're selling fraudulent invoices to real businesses. Every layer we peel back reveals another 10. Henry finally took the file and opened it. Pages filled with corporate names that led nowhere. Logistics companies that didn't exist. Warehouses that had burned down a week before their scheduled inspection. And now somehow this woman Tu Kai was tangled right in the middle of it. "We're seeing violence between these groups now," the lieutenant continued. "Protection rackets. Turf wars. One gang cuts off another, then extorts the businesses in that zone. It's escalating." "And the girl?" Henry asked without lifting his eyes. "Any connection between her and these groups?" "Nothing direct yet. But she's the daughter of Nguyen Tan Dan, the businessman who was murdered 12 years ago." Henry froze. "I thought that case was sealed." "It was. But something doesn't add up. After her father died, she disappeared. Then she resurfaces years later under a different name. Tu Kai, blind, injured, with no memory." Henry shut the folder and turned toward the window. Rain was tapping against the glass like distant footsteps. "She worked at a company for a while after returning from overseas. High performer. But then she abruptly quit and vanished. We're looking into her resignation records now. Find out what happened to her between quitting and the accident. Someone tried to erase her." "Yes, sir." "And find out if there's a link between her and the man who was seen near the riverbank the day she was found. We suspect he may be connected to one of the gangs. But we don't have a positive ID yet." Henry nodded. "Keep me updated. And send someone to her current location. Quietly. I want her protected." Out in the rural mountains, the sky was a dull gray. Tu Kai sat beneath the wooden eaves of a small farmhouse, her fingers running slowly across the edge of a clay teacup. Her eyes, clouded with trauma, stared into a space that no one else could see. The silence around her was soft, the kind of quiet that wrapped itself around you like a blanket and asked nothing in return. She couldn't remember her name. She couldn't remember her past. Every time she tried, a piercing pain shot through her temples like broken glass grinding inside her skull. Who am I? Where did I come from? And why do I feel like someone is watching me? She touched the bandage over her forehead. The scars weren't just on her body. They were inside her, woven into her nerves like a code waiting to be decrypted. Inside the house, an elderly couple moved gently through their morning routines. Mr. Tamhoa prepared the rice porridge. His wife folded clothes by the window, stealing glances at the girl who had arrived unconscious weeks ago. They'd taken her in, cared for her, asked for nothing in return. But even kindness had its limits, especially when danger lurked so close to home. "She's not safe here," Mr. Tam muttered. "I know," his wife said softly, "but she doesn't trust anyone else. Not even the young man who brought the doctor last week. Henry." The name made her stomach tighten. He had visited twice. Always calm, always kind, but there was a sharpness behind his eyes, like a blade hidden in silk. He asked questions not just about her health, but about her past, about the night of the accident. She remembered nothing, or maybe she was afraid to remember. Henry returned to his private quarters late that night, drenched in data and dread. He poured himself a small glass of whiskey but didn't drink it. Instead, he stood before the evidence board in his study, a sprawling web of strings, photographs, news clippings, and printed maps. In the center, underlined in red, was her name, Nguyen Trajong. He stared at a photograph taken from a security camera 2 months before the accident. She was walking through a government office, dressed in formal attire, a file clutched to her chest, her expression purposeful. But on the bottom right corner of the frame, just barely captured, was a man, blurred, hunched, watching her. Henry didn't believe in coincidences. He picked up his phone. "Nam," he said as soon as the line connected. "I need you to run facial recognition on the man in frame 21C from the provincial building. Priority 1. "I'm already working on it," Nam replied. "Sir, I think he's connected to the gang from the riverside." Henry's pulse quickened. "The same one responsible for the smuggling operations?" "Yes, and possibly the one that tried to kill her." Meanwhile, Zhang sat on the porch under a sky heavy with stars, her head bowed, her fingers trembling. "I don't want to be anyone's burden," she whispered to herself. "Not the old couple. Not the man who says he wants to help me." But her heart ached with more than physical pain. Somewhere deep inside, she felt guilt, an unbearable weight that she couldn't explain. Every time someone tried to comfort her, she felt the urge to run. Every time someone showed her kindness, her chest tightened with panic. She didn't just fear the world. She feared herself. Mr. Tam walked out quietly, carrying a folded blanket. "You'll get cold," he said gently. "The nights are sharp out here." She took the blanket but didn't speak. He sat beside her, letting silence carry the weight of everything unspoken. "You know," he said, "when we found you, you were gripping something in your hand. Even when unconscious, you didn't let go." She turned to him, puzzled. "A necklace. Broken. With initials carved into the locket GT." Her fingers moved unconsciously to her chest. She hadn't even realized the necklace was gone. "I thought your name was Tukai," he asked. I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe that was never my name at all." At dawn, Henry drove alone up the winding road to the mountains. The mist was thick, wrapping around the hills like ghostly fingers. He had made up his mind. No more distance. No more waiting. He arrived just as the chickens began to stir and the sun peered through the fog. Mr. Tam greeted him at the gate, wiping his hands on his apron. "She's inside," he said. "Didn't sleep much last night." Henry nodded and entered quietly. Zhang was seated on a small stool, staring blankly at the floor. She didn't look up when she heard him, but she didn't flinch either. "I found someone," he said. "A doctor in the capital. He thinks he can help. With my eyes. With your memories too. But you'll have to come with me." She said nothing. He kneeled in front of her. "I don't know what happened to you, but I promise I will protect you. No matter what." A tear slipped from her eye. "I don't know who to trust," she whispered. "I don't even know if I can trust myself." "Then start with me." The car rumbled steadily down the mountain path, winding through mist and morning fog. Zhang sat in the passenger seat beside Henry, her body still, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Though she had agreed to leave with him, part of her heart still clung to the quiet of the hills, the safety of the old couple's home. Every tree they passed felt like a goodbye. Henry didn't speak much. He focused on the road, glancing at her only when she turned her face toward the window. He knew she wasn't ready. Trust took time, and she had lost all sense of what time even meant. After hours of silence, she finally spoke. "Why are you helping me?" He glanced at her, surprised by the question's softness. "You were left alone," he said. "And I don't like leaving people in the dark when I can bring them into the light." "That's not an answer," she whispered. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." "You're right," he admitted. "I don't. But something about this case, about you. I can't let it go." She looked at him, her eyes cloudy but sincere. "Do you think I did something wrong?" "No," he said without hesitation. "But I think someone made sure you forgot what they didn't want you to remember." The hospital was tall, sterile, and humming with quiet urgency. Zhang shrank into herself as they entered, the brightness of the white floors and clean walls a sharp contrast to the earthy comfort of the countryside.